Hi there! Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Diane Chaplin, and I am going to play 4 pieces of solo cello music for you today, and they all have a theme that binds them together. And that theme is the Baroque suite and preludes, which are generally parts of Baroque suites. At least the Bach cello suites all have a prelude that starts with them. The first piece I'm going to play falls into that Baroque suite category. It's by a composer who was born in Amsterdam in the Baroque time. His name is Johann Schenck, and he was basically the generation before Bach. Bach is sort of kind of the grandfather of the Baroque period. He kind of closes out the Baroque period. So Schenck is the generation before him, and he wrote particularly for the viola da gamba, which is kind of a precursor of the cello. It's approximately the same size as a cello. It has frets like a guitar. It has a different setup of strings, more strings, and it's really mellow. And so a lot of music for viola da gamba is intended to be background to dinners and things like that. It's not so much of a concert instrument, and it really by the late Baroque it had pretty much fallen out of fashion. So Schenck wrote many suites for viola da gamba with accompanying bass line, basso continuo, which means a keyboard along with a bass instrument. And the movement I'm going to play today is a chaconne, which comes from his suite number 10, and it was originally written as a piece that has an accompaniment with it, and kind of it goes on for a while. But 200 years after it was written, a guy named Friedrich Gruetzmacher, who was a Romantic era cellist, came along and fussed with it to some extent, rewrote some of it. Gruetzmacher was famous for improving works by older composers to fit the Romantic aesthetic of sounding fuller, sounding more imaginative, perhaps. And actually the original of the Schenck is fairly low-key. So in this instance, I think that Gruetzmacher actually has done us a favor, because he's made this piece accessible for cello and written some extra variations that go in that make it a little flashier, possibly. The chaconne is a variation movement of continuing variations that is based on generally something really short. And in this case, it's based on 4 bass notes, which sound like this. And then Gruetzmacher often does the repeat of the phrase up an octave. And when I looked at the Schenck original of this, the bass line part plays those 4 notes almost exclusively through the entire piece. So it's fairly repetitive. It doesn't sound repetitive at all in the way it really is woven together with the variations and the melodic line. So this is a chaconne by Johann Schenck as revised by Friedrich Gruetzmacher. The next piece that I'm going to play is a piece that is written by a Russian composer whose name is Sofia Gubaidulina. She is one of the leading composers from Russia, alive at this time. She was born in 1931, and so she grew up during the Soviet regime, which was incredibly repressive for artists, for composers, anyone doing creative things in Russia. They were consistently suppressed by the authorities, who felt that they needed to control the quality of what was coming out of Russia. They didn't want things to be too dissonant or too avant-garde or too controversial. And so as a result, composers like Gubaidulina had to sort of study in secret, try to get scores, purloined scores from the West, to find out what the composers in the mid-20th century were doing, what new things they were inventing. And she did manage to write in quite a contemporary fashion. The piece that I'm going to play two preludes that come from a set called 10 Preludes for Solo Cello. And they were written in 1974, and you'll hear that they sound quite contemporary. In 1979, she was blacklisted for whatever thing she was writing at that time. So definitely she had trouble with the authorities. Another thing that arose out of kind of the Soviet repression was her great attachment to spirituality and to religion, which also was a thing that was banned in the Soviet Union, where they basically pretended that religion didn't exist anymore. And of course it did. And she became very, very inspired and devoted to certain spiritual pursuits. She infused her music with this love of God and found ways in everything that she wrote to feel like she was reaching towards God. For instance, it is written that she treats musical space as a means of attaining unity with the divine, that music is a direct line to God. And one of the ways she does that is when things slide, called glissando, when she writes things that go, where they slide in without steps in between them. That is showing that there are no steps to God, that basically you slide in directly to God. The thing that I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show you a couple of the techniques that I'm going to use. So I'm going to play the third prelude and the sixth prelude from the set. The third prelude is called Con sordini senza sordini, which in Italian means with a mute or without a mute. I'll show you a couple of mutes here. So a mute is a thing that you put on the bridge of the cello, which muffles the sound. And normally I would use this little mute, which kind of hooks onto the strings, but in this instance it's actually too hard for me to get it on and off quickly. So instead I'm going to use this, which cellists will recognize as a practice mute. So a practice mute is the thing that you put on to muffle the sound of your instrument a lot when you're trying to practice late at night and not bother housemates, or you're in a hotel. And it goes on top of the bridge. I'm not going to demonstrate it for you because you're going to hear it. Actually, I'll put it on because I'm going to start with it. No, I won't. Hold on. You're going to hear how it changes the sound. It really makes quite a difference in the sound. The second piece I'm going to play, the second prelude, is one that is called flageoletti, which means harmonics. So harmonics on the cello are when you touch a note very lightly. So if I touch a note with full finger strength, it might sound like this. When I touch it lightly, It makes this very high floaty sound, kind of hooty. So you can play really high notes at what normally we think of as the low range of the cello. And Gubaidulina uses harmonics to represent joy as an elevated state of spiritual thought. And so there's a quote from her. The possibility for string instruments to derive pitches of various highs and lows at one and the same place on the string can be experienced in music as the transition to another plane of existence. And that is joy. And it's interesting that in this harmonics movement, the sections that are the quicker sections, she writes giocoso, which means joyfully, playfully. There is one technique that I would like to describe because I haven't seen anyone else play this, and I don't know if other people do this, but they may. There's something that she wrote that is impossible for my hand to play, and maybe there's a hand out there that can, but I can't. You have to push on this note and reach up and touch here, and there's no way my hand can go there. So you're going to notice that I'm going to play the bottom note with my face and the harmonic note with my finger, and I call this a chin harmonic. This is the only time in my life I've used this technique, although I've threatened to use it many times. Okay, so this is going to be Preludes 3 and 6 from 10 Preludes for Solo Cello by Sofia Gubaidulina. So this is Women's History Month, and although I think we should play music by women all the time, certainly during Women's History Month I'm trying to take that opportunity. So I'm going to play another piece by a woman composer. This next one is by Dorothy Moore, who is one of the preeminent African-American composers in our country. She was born in 1940, and she and her husband Kermit Moore were the founders of the Society of Black Composers in New York City. Kermit was a very well-respected cellist in New York. When I lived there, I definitely knew of him. And for their wedding, she wrote this piece, this solo cello piece, which is called Baroque Suite. Her music was never published. I think none of her existing compositions were published, but now the American Composers Alliance has made available from their website most, if not all, of her compositions, which is where I got this. So this Baroque Suite is in 3 movements, which are loosely based on Baroque ideas. I kind of think that the first movement, to me, a little bit sounds like the Brandenburg Concerto No. 3 by Bach, this idea. Because, so now that's the Bach part, and now I will play you the first little bit of the first movement of the Dorothy Moore first movement. So you get a little tiny bit of that essence there. But what's interesting about this Baroque Suite that I'm going to play is that was in 5, that movement. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2. And that keeps the whole way through it. So it has this sort of interesting, sounds a little bit Baroque, but it kind of limps, and then some of the time it definitely doesn't sound Baroque. But I think it's a very inventive way to use Baroque idiom. The second movement is the slow movement, marked molto adagio. This is my favorite movement of this piece. I used to think that it didn't have very much Baroque connection, but then when I started really thinking about chaconnes and the passacaglia, which is a related form, I realized that this slow movement has a phrase that gets repeated, and each time it repeats there's a variation, a slight variation on it, and I think that maybe is the essence of Baroque in this piece. It's very profound and romantic, beautiful, beautiful movement. Then the last movement is what we would call a gigue if it were a suite by an actual Baroque composer. She doesn't call it that, but it very clearly is based on a gigue. So a gigue would be something that would go yum ba dun da 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 yum da dun da 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 da, something along those lines. What she does is, again, kind of a twist on that. She puts it in a it's not written in a meter of 7, but there's 7 beats in the phrase. So it goes 1 and 2 and 3, 4 or 5, 6, 7. 1 and 2 and 3, 4 or 5, 6 and 7. 1 and 2. So which again gives it sort of like the first movement, this slightly odd limping quality as you go. So this is the 3-movement Baroque Suite by Dorothy Moore. I think my cello stopped ringing now. It's such joy in that piece. There's such a wonderful, different kinds of emotions, and I think very Baroque and at the same time also very contemporary. So the last piece that I'm going to play is the Prelude from the Sixth Suite in D major by Johann Sebastian Bach. And one of the reasons that I'm playing it is because I have this ongoing project called Bach Cello Suites Harmonized, where I do a sort of sacrilegious thing to Bach, which is I improve it just like Friedrich Gruetzmacher. I didn't actually write the improvements. In the 18th century, a few different pianists wrote accompaniments to the solo Bach suite, so that's the sacrilegious part, because these are great works of art. They don't need an extra thing, and yet, in the Romantic era, it was felt that they needed to be improved. So a few different composers, including Robert Schumann, wrote some accompaniment, although evidently Robert Schumann like ripped his up because Clara said, that's a terrible thing, you shouldn't do it. But in any case, what I've done is I've taken those piano accompaniments and I've arranged them for cello ensemble, and I play them along with myself as my COVID project, because I can do that sitting here with the recording. And I think they're really fascinating. They actually turn out not to be very tacky. They actually turn out to be really beautiful and really wonderful. So if you haven't heard them, please go to my webpage or my YouTube channel to hear these Bach suites harmonized. So this month, in honor of my birthday and Bach's birthday, which is either March 21st or March 31st, depending on whether you use the old style calendar or the new style calendar, so we're right in between. For Bach's birthday, I released another set of suites, and I released the D major suite. And one of the things I want to talk about this briefly before I play it is Bach's use of bariolage. And bariolage means going back and forth between two strings. This is a thing that was basically not a possibility quickly on the ancient instruments like the viola da gamba. And so when any new musical period happens, it usually happens because some instruments got invented. And what made the Baroque period happen is that the violin family got invented. And one of the things you can do on these instruments is you can go and back and forth, and it sounds like you're doing things really fast, but as you'll notice, my hand didn't even move. It was just my bow moving. So you're going to notice a huge amount of bariolage technique through this piece. So this is the Prelude from the Suite number 6 in D major by Johann Sebastian Bach. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again in April. Bye!